It was 1979, and tensions were high between the United States and the Soviet Union. Only 4 years earlier, South Vietnam had fallen. The communist-ruled North Vietnam had triumphed over the South. Communism had prevailed there and spread, even after the United States mounted an enormous resistance to this, a 10-year war that resulted in 300,000 American casualties. Only 1 year after this, a communist government was established in Angola. Communism was spreading in places around the world. Then in 1978, in the Tsar Revolution, the Communist People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, or the PDPA, took control of the government. Another communist government had begun. Because of this, many parts of the country revolted against this communist government, and it soon appeared that this had become another capitalist versus communist conflict, and by extension, an indirect conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. On the 24th of December 1979, the Soviets chose to invade Afghanistan on the pretext of the continuation of the Soviet-Afghan Friendship Treaty, which had been made on the 8th of December in 1978. The treaty was between the leader of the Afghan Communist Party, Nur Muhammad Taraki, and the USSR, allowing the Soviets to, at any time, provide economic or military support. Later, when Taraki was assassinated by his own Communist Party, the Soviet Union felt the need to take control and install a new government and leader who would follow the Soviets' desires. The Soviets launched in the night a mobilized airlift of 25,500 soldiers to begin the stabilization of Afghanistan. By the 27th of December, 75,000 soldiers had been deployed around the country to enforce the new protocol. The Soviet troops were meant to stabilize the country, but they had an almost opposite effect, inciting even more rebellion and causing more people to join the Mujahideen, the name of the growing rebellion. Approximately 125,000 Soviet troops were stationed almost entirely in the large cities, causing the resistance to build in the countryside and mountains. However, at this point, the rebel troops attempted to fight the Soviet troops on level ground, and didn't use the land to their advantage. Because of this, with superior Soviet weapons, the Mujahideen found themselves fighting a losing battle. "We'll be damned by history if we let them fight with stones," said Texas Congressman Charles Wilson. Wilson played a lead part in the United States Operation Cyclone. The operation was a plan by the United States to help the Mujahideen with their battle against the Soviet troops. Operation Cyclone was the longest and most expensive covert CIA operation in history. The cost of sustaining Operation Cyclone in the beginning was between $20 and $30 million per year, but later in the operation the cost arose to $630 million per year. In 1979, President Carter signed a bill supporting anti-communist guerrillas in Afghanistan. One of the most essential weapons given to the Afghan guerrillas were anti-aircraft weapons, such as the Stinger missile. The Mujahideen needed these weapons because the Soviets had far more advanced weaponry, such as the Mi-8 and the Mi-24 helicopters. These helicopters caused especially large problems for the Mujahideen, as they had practically no way of shooting them down effectively. For this reason, the Soviet military used these helicopters to wreak havoc upon the Afghan rebel group. In addition to these helicopters, the Soviets possessed more advanced weaponry and had more well-trained troops. On the other hand, the Mujahideen had poorly trained forces and cheaply made weapons that failed regularly. However, the one thing that the Mujahideen did have was extensive knowledge of the land, and once they received proper training and weaponry from the CIA, they possessed a fairly large advantage over the Soviets. These combined factors would eventually lead to the Soviets' downfall.
For a period of about 100 days after the introduction of the Stinger, the Soviets were losing one aircraft per day. One aircraft per day. This drove this into the high-cost arena in a hurry. And as a matter of fact, the impact of these kinds of losses was significant from a number of ways. Not only the hardware losses, but the fact that morale started to go down. Transport pilots wouldn't fly.
The FIM-92 Stinger missiles supplied by the CIA were demolishing the Soviet gunships and transport helicopters, and more importantly, Soviet morale. This caused mutinies and desertions by Soviet troops and soldiers in the now Soviet-controlled Afghan army. Another Mujahideen tactic that was causing huge problems for the Soviets was ambushes. A large contingent of the Soviet force in Afghanistan was tank forces, but these tanks were designed to fight a war in Europe, where the ground is primarily flat and there are well-developed roads. In Afghanistan, neither of these conditions exist, so all tanks and other motorized vehicles that the Soviets possessed had to move very slowly on the rough mountain roads. They were also unable to go off the roads, creating a perfect situation for laying mines and ambushes. Mujahideen would then hide up in the mountains with rocket launchers, provided them by the CIA. When a tank drove over a mine, the hidden Mujahideen fighters would immediately fire their rockets at the tank and destroy it. Mujahideen used this technique to Soviet supply lines with great success, and brought Soviet morale into a downward spiral. In early 1987, Soviet troop withdrawal was seriously being discussed. The generals of the Soviet Union began to see that they were fighting a battle that could not be won. They could hold the cities with their superior firepower, but they saw that there was no way they would be able to flush the Mujahideen out of their mountain hideouts. In February of 1988, Mikhail Gorbachev formally announced that the Soviets were withdrawing from Afghanistan. The withdrawal began on May 15, 1988, and the last soldier crossed the border back into the USSR on the 15th of February, 1989. And the Soviet Union airlifted 3 divisions of infantry and regiments of tanks rolled over the mountains. The Soviets were crossing physical borders.
Soon after taking control of the Afghan government, the Soviets were asked by the United States and the United Nations to withdraw from Afghanistan and cease all activities.
Implications of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan could pose the most serious threat to the peace since the Second World War. The vast majority of nations on earth have condemned this latest Soviet attempt to extend its colonial domination of others.
They refused to comply with the UN's demands, and they began to entrench themselves in the cities of Afghanistan. Over the years, by refusing to comply with the requests of the international community, they were refusing to transcend borders, consider other nations, and through this, defining another border. However, one of the greatest examples of transcending borders that arose during this conflict came not from the Soviets, but the Americans and the Mujahideen. The Americans transcended their preconceived notions of what an ally should be, and associated themselves with people that they might never have thought of dealing with before. As the Americans supplied the Mujahideen with weaponry, they purchased weapons from the Chinese, Egyptian, and the Czechoslovakian governments. Most surprisingly, America was able to purchase weapons from the corrupted sections of the Soviet Union Army, which in turn would be used against their fellow comrades. Soon after the final withdrawal of the Soviets, civil war broke out, resulting in factions of former rebel groups fighting amongst themselves. Losses from the war in Afghanistan, combined with other factors, led to a crippling financial deficit and played a direct role in the collapse of the Soviet Union. Afghanistan began slipping into a state of anarchy, as warlords struggled for power throughout their country. Over the years that civil war ravaged the country, the Taliban rose to a competitive stance as they exerted their power over other rebel groups. Soon, 90% of Afghanistan was under Taliban control, leaving no opposition with enough power to compete against them. America would invade Afghanistan in 2001 in attempts to drive out Al-Qaeda because of the September 11th attacks, bringing tension to the region. Fighting broke out between the Taliban and the United States military, resulting in years of turmoil. With a withdrawal plan set for 2011, our experiences in Afghanistan show striking similarities to the Soviets' war. The Cold War transcended many borders and created many more, and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was no different in this. The Soviet Union defining borders and defying the wishes of the entire world. In the many ways, all the parties involved transcending borders.